Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to breaking news bulletins flooding every screen on Earth. The figure millions have worshipped for 2,000 years stands visible in the skies above Jerusalem, witnessed simultaneously by 8 billion people through satellite feeds, smartphones, and their own eyes. In a single moment, every atheist becomes a believer, every government becomes obsolete, and every certainty you've ever held crumbles like ancient parchment. But what happens next? What happens when prophecy becomes reality and faith becomes sight? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Tonight, we dive into the most earth-shattering scenario imaginable: the return of Jesus Christ in our modern world. This isn't just another religious discussion. This is a journey through the collapse of civilization as we know it, and the birth of something beyond human comprehension. Chapter 1: The Prophecy Awakens. For 2,000 years, believers have scanned the headlines searching for signs. Wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes in diverse places, false prophets rising to deceive many. These aren't just ancient words on yellowed pages anymore. They're the breaking news alerts lighting up our phones every single day. The prophecy began with Jesus himself, speaking to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, just days before his crucifixion. "I will come again," he promised, describing signs that would herald his return. Matthew chapter 24 paints a picture so vivid that modern believers see it reflected in today's chaos. Nation rising against nation, famines and pestilences sweeping the globe, the sun darkened and the moon turning blood red. But here's what makes this prophecy different from ancient mythology. It's specific. It names places we can visit, events we can verify, and signs we can witness. The fig tree of Israel would bloom again, Jesus said, and this generation would not pass away until all things were fulfilled. In 1948, Israel became a nation after 2,000 years of diaspora. The countdown clock began ticking. Throughout history, zealous believers have set dates and built movements around failed predictions. The Great Disappointment of 1844 left thousands devastated when Christ didn't return as William Miller calculated. Harold Camping's predictions in 2011 left followers bankrupt and broken. Yet each failure only seemed to intensify the longing, the watching, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Today's prophecy watchers aren't just fringe believers meeting in basement Bible studies. They're Silicon Valley executives studying artificial intelligence through the lens of revelation. They're NASA scientists tracking asteroid trajectories while remembering that the Bible speaks of stars falling from heaven. They're economists watching cryptocurrency markets while pondering what happens to money when the kingdom of heaven establishes its own economy. The signs aren't just in dusty theological books anymore. They're in our news feeds, our scientific journals, and our sleepless nights, wondering if we're living in the final chapter of human history. Chapter 2: Signs in the Heavens. The blood moon rises over Jerusalem, and millions of smartphones capture its crimson glow. Social media explodes with speculation as astronomy meets prophecy in real time. This isn't just another lunar eclipse. It's the fourth in a series that falls precisely on Jewish holy days, a pattern so rare that statisticians calculate odds of 15 million to 1. Pastor John Hagee calls them harbingers, pointing to how these blood moon tetrads coincided with pivotal moments in Jewish history. 1492 brought Columbus and the Spanish Inquisition. 1948 witnessed Israel's rebirth as a nation. 1967 saw Jerusalem return to Jewish control during the Six-Day War. Now, in 2014 and 2015, the pattern repeats, while the world watches through digital eyes that previous generations never possessed. But the signs extend far beyond celestial mechanics. Israel's transformation from scattered refugees to a nuclear-armed nation happened within a single generation, fulfilling Ezekiel's vision of dry bones coming to life. The Jewish people returning to their ancient homeland wasn't just political, it was prophetic. After 19 centuries of persecution, pogroms, and the Holocaust's attempted annihilation, the impossible became inevitable. Technology amplifies every sign, making global awareness instantaneous. When earthquakes strike in diverse places, seismic monitors broadcast the data worldwide within minutes. When famines devastate regions, satellite imagery documents the suffering in high resolution. When wars erupt, drone footage streams directly to our devices, making us eyewitnesses to biblical proportions of destruction that previous generations could only imagine. The coronavirus pandemic swept across the globe, and suddenly everyone understood what pestilence meant. Lockdowns confined billions to their homes, while economic systems crumbled and social structures fractured. For the first time in modern history, the entire world experienced synchronized suffering that made ancient prophecies feel urgently contemporary. Mask mandates reminded believers of Revelation's mark, without which no one could buy or sell. Vaccine passports felt like rehearsals for end times control systems. Scientists dismiss these correlations as confirmation bias and pattern-seeking behavior. But believers see something deeper, a convergence of signs that transforms biblical prophecy from ancient literature into breaking news. The question isn't whether these events are happening. The question is whether they're random coincidences or divine orchestration preparing the world for its final act. Chapter 3. The moment everything changes. Tuesday morning, 7:43 a.m. Jerusalem time. CNN breaks into regular programming with shaking hands and stuttering voices. The anchor can barely comprehend her own words. We're receiving unconfirmed reports of a figure appearing in the skies above the Temple Mount, visible to crowds gathering below and confirmed by multiple independent sources. But this isn't unconfirmed for long. Within minutes, every news network, every streaming platform, every social media feed shows the same impossible image. A figure of pure light suspended above Jerusalem's ancient stones, arms outstretched in a pose that every Christian recognizes from Sunday school flannel boards. Except this isn't felt fabric on a classroom wall. This is reality breaking through the clouds of the ordinary world. The figure speaks, and somehow every person on earth hears it in their native language. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. As I promised, I have returned to establish my kingdom. The voice doesn't come through speakers or satellites. It resonates directly into human consciousness, bypassing technology entirely and speaking soul to soul. Smartphones and cameras capture the event from every angle, but the recordings show something that shouldn't be possible. The same figure appears simultaneously above Jerusalem, above Vatican City, above Protestant cathedrals in America, above Orthodox churches in Russia, and above every place where believers have gathered to worship throughout history. Multiple locations, one presence, defying every law of physics that humanity has ever discovered. Air traffic controllers watch their screens in stunned silence as commercial aircraft flying over the Middle East report the same phenomenon. This is El Al Flight 407. We have visual confirmation of an unidentified luminous figure at approximately 15,000 feet above Jerusalem. Passengers and crew are witnessing what appears to be. The radio transmission trails off into reverential silence. Stock markets crash within hours, not from economic panic, but from existential shock. How do you price commodities when eternity just intersected with time? How do you calculate quarterly earnings when the eternal kingdom has arrived? Trading floors empty as Wall Street executives abandon their terminals and fall to their knees. Trillion-dollar portfolios suddenly meaningless in the face of infinite worth. Emergency sessions convene in world capitals, but what do you discuss when human authority just became obsolete? The United Nations Security Council calls an unprecedented meeting, but their resolutions carry no weight against divine decree. Presidents and prime ministers issue statements to populations who aren't listening to earthly leaders anymore. The moment everything changes isn't gradual. It's instantaneous, devastating, and irreversible. 2,000 years of waiting end in a single heartbeat that splits history into before and after, with no possibility of return to the world that existed just moments earlier. Chapter 4. When Heaven Meets Earth. The impossible becomes commonplace as supernatural power floods into natural reality. In hospitals across the globe, patients in terminal wards suddenly sit up in their beds, cancer vanishing from their bodies as if it never existed. Wheelchairs empty as paralyzed limbs move for the first time in decades. The blind see, the deaf hear, and children born with genetic disorders laugh as their DNA rewrites itself according to divine design. Dr. Sarah Chen, head of oncology at Johns Hopkins, watches her entire ward empty within hours. Tumors that had resisted chemotherapy, radiation, and experimental treatments simply dissolve. Medical equipment designed to monitor failing organs now displays perfect health readings. "I've spent my career fighting cancer," she tells a CNN reporter while tears stream down her face. "Now I don't know if I have a job anymore because there's no more cancer to fight." But the miracles extend far beyond human healing. Environmental destruction reverses as creation itself responds to its creator's presence. Polluted rivers run crystal clear overnight. Toxic waste sites bloom with vegetation that shouldn't be able to survive in contaminated soil. The hole in the ozone layer seals itself as atmospheric chemistry obeys divine command rather than industrial damage. Dead relatives appear in family homes, not as ghosts or memories, but as fully restored human beings embracing loved ones who had mourned their loss for years. Grandparents hug grandchildren they never met. Parents reunite with children lost to accidents and diseases. Cemeteries worldwide stand empty as graves open and release their occupants, not as zombies from horror movies, but as perfected versions of themselves. The scientific community faces an existential crisis as their instruments record phenomena that violate every natural law. Physicists watch as energy conservation breaks down and matter creates itself from nothing. Biologists document cellular regeneration that ignores genetic limitations. Chemists observe molecular structures that shouldn't be stable according to quantum mechanics. Professor Stephen Hawking's successor at Cambridge University, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, attempts to maintain scientific objectivity while documenting the undocumented. We're witnessing events that require us to completely reconsider our understanding of reality, she explains to a gathering of the world's leading scientists. Either our fundamental laws of physics are wrong, or we're experiencing intervention from outside the natural order entirely. Justice manifests as swiftly as healing. Corrupt politicians confess their crimes spontaneously, unable to maintain deception in the presence of absolute truth. Human trafficking networks collapse as their victims simply vanish, transported to safety by unseen hands. Weapons of war malfunction as military technology refuses to operate for destructive purposes. The kingdom of heaven doesn't gradually influence earthly systems. It completely replaces them with supernatural alternatives that make human institutions look like children playing with toy governments and pretend economies. Chapter 5. The Great Sorting. The most controversial doctrine in Christianity becomes horrifying reality as humanity divides into two groups, those who disappear and those who remain. In a single moment that theologians debated for centuries, the rapture transforms from theoretical theology into devastating separation. Families torn apart sit in living rooms staring at empty chairs. A husband vanishes while his wife watches television beside him. Children disappear from playgrounds while their parents frantically search empty swings and slides. The sorting isn't gradual or negotiable. It's instantaneous and final, leaving survivors to grapple with the crushing realization that their loved ones qualified for something they didn't. Air traffic control centers report catastrophic emergencies as pilots disappear mid-flight, leaving passenger planes pilotless at 30,000 feet. Highway patrol officers respond to thousands of empty vehicles crashed along roadsides, their drivers simply gone. Hospital emergency rooms flood with trauma cases from accidents caused by operators who vanished from moving machinery. Churches empty differently than expected. Some congregations disappear entirely, their buildings left with nothing but empty pews and abandoned Bibles. Other sanctuaries remain packed with confused worshippers, wondering why they weren't selected. Decades of faithful attendance, generous tithing, and religious service apparently counted for nothing in the divine calculation. The theological implications devastate religious communities. Catholics discover that many priests remain, while some parishioners disappear. Protestant denominations fragment as their theological certainties shatter against the reality of who was actually chosen. Millions who considered themselves faithful believers face the terrifying possibility that intellectual assent to doctrine isn't the same as genuine faith. Dr. James Patterson, professor of theology at Dallas Seminary, broadcasts from his empty classroom to address the crisis. We taught that belief in Jesus was sufficient for salvation, but apparently there's a difference between believing about Jesus and truly knowing him. The criteria for the rapture weren't what we expected, and now we have to face the possibility that many of us got it wrong. Survivor's guilt overwhelms those left behind. Parents who lost children to the rapture question every decision they made in raising them. Spouses abandoned by their partners replay conversations, wondering if they could have said something to change the outcome. The psychological trauma of witnessing loved ones qualify for paradise while you remain earthbound creates a new category of mental anguish that no therapist knows how to treat. But the most disturbing aspect isn't emotional, it's practical. The disappearance of millions of people creates massive infrastructure failures. Nuclear power plants lose their operators. Air traffic control towers empty during peak flight times. Emergency services collapse as first responders vanish mid-shift. The Great Sorting reveals that divine selection operates by criteria hidden from human understanding, leaving survivors to face an uncertain future without the people they assumed would be there forever. Chapter 6: Empires Fall, Kingdoms Rise. The Pentagon's Situation Room falls silent as generals realize their authority comes from a government that no longer matters. Nuclear launch codes become meaningless when warfare itself is obsolete. Five-star generals who commanded armies across continents now face the ultimate commander who needs no weapons to establish absolute control. The President of the United States addresses an empty Congress, his words echoing through chambers abandoned by representatives who either raptured away or fled to their home districts to witness civilization's transformation. The Constitution, that sacred document crafted by brilliant minds and defended by patriot blood, becomes historical curiosity in the face of divine law that supersedes human legislation. China's Communist Party discovers that their atheistic ideology crumbles when confronted with undeniable proof of the divine. The Great Wall, that once protected an empire from foreign invasion, offers no defense against heavenly authority. President Xi Jinping's carefully constructed surveillance state becomes irrelevant when the returned Christ sees into every human heart without need for cameras or artificial intelligence. European Union headquarters in Brussels transforms into a monument to human ambition rendered obsolete. Centuries of diplomatic progress toward unified governance pale in comparison to the instant establishment of universal divine rule. The euro loses all value not through market manipulation, but through the simple fact that earthly currency has no worth in an eternal kingdom. Russia's Vladimir Putin, accustomed to wielding power through intimidation and force, finds himself powerless against authority that requires neither armies nor threats. The Kremlin's walls that sheltered czars and commissars offer no protection from judgment that penetrates stone and steel to examine the human soul directly. Jerusalem transforms from contested territory to acknowledged capital of earth. The Temple Mount, disputed for centuries between religions, becomes the undisputed throne room of the returned king. Israeli Prime Minister's office relocates not through political negotiation, but through divine decree that settles ownership disputes with finality no United Nations resolution ever achieved. Military bases worldwide empty as soldiers abandon their posts, not through desertion, but through recognition that their ultimate commander has arrived. Weapon systems designed to destroy enemies become useless when the Prince of Peace establishes rule that makes warfare impossible. Aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines become expensive museums floating in oceans that no longer need protection from human conflict. The World Bank closes its doors permanently as economists realize that scarcity no longer exists in a realm where divine provision replaces market dynamics. International Monetary Fund officials abandon their computers as debt becomes meaningless, and wealth redistribution happens through supernatural abundance rather than complex financial instruments. Nation-states dissolve not through conquest or revolution, but through voluntary submission to authority that makes human borders irrelevant. Passports and visas become historical artifacts as citizenship transfers from earthly countries to the eternal kingdom, where immigration policy is determined by divine acceptance rather than bureaucratic approval. Chapter 7: When Science Meets Miracle. Harvard Medical School closes its doors as professors realize their textbooks have become obsolete overnight. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, head of neurosurgery, cancels all scheduled operations because her patient's brain tumors have vanished. How do you practice medicine when disease no longer exists? She asks colleagues who built careers fighting conditions that divine presence eliminated instantly. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN shuts down as physicists abandon their search for fundamental particles when confronted with phenomena that transcend particle physics entirely. Multi-billion-dollar equipment designed to unlock universe's secrets sits idle while scientists witness reality operating according to principles no equation can describe. MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory falls silent as researchers realize their algorithms cannot process supernatural events. Machine learning models trained on natural data crash when attempting to analyze miracles that violate every pattern they were programmed to recognize. Dr. Alan Chang, the lab's director, stares at error messages flooding his screens. System failure, unable to categorize impossible event. Nobel Prize committees prepare their final awards as the categories that defined scientific achievement become meaningless. Chemistry prizes can't be awarded when molecular structures obey divine command rather than atomic bonds. Physics medals lose relevance when natural laws yield to supernatural intervention. Medicine honors become pointless when healing happens through prayer rather than peer-reviewed research. Richard Dawkins, evolution's most famous advocate, faces cameras for what he announces will be his final interview. "I built my career on the premise that God is a delusion," he admits with trembling hands. "I was wrong. Spectacularly, embarrassingly, completely wrong. Every book I wrote, every debate I won, every atheist I convinced, all of it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality." Universities worldwide cancel classes as professors realize their expertise belongs to a world that no longer exists. Philosophy departments empty as questions about meaning and purpose receive definitive answers from divine revelation rather than academic speculation. Psychology programs close as mental healing happens through spiritual transformation rather than therapeutic intervention. Scientific journals publish their final editions filled with retractions and corrections as researchers acknowledge that their peer-reviewed conclusions were wrong about the nature of existence itself. The New England Journal of Medicine prints a special issue titled, "When Faith Becomes Fact: The End of Evidence-Based Medicine." Laboratory equipment designed to measure natural phenomena registers readings that break calibrated scales. Microscopes reveal cellular activity that defies biological understanding. Telescopes capture images of heavenly beings that astronomy never predicted. Particle accelerators detect divine energy that exists outside the standard model of physics. Dr. Francis Collins, former director of the National Institutes of Health and a practicing Christian, addresses the scientific community's crisis. "I spent my career trying to reconcile faith and science. I never imagined that faith would prove science incomplete rather than incompatible. We weren't wrong about what we discovered. We were wrong about what we thought was possible to discover." The scientific method itself becomes obsolete when hypothesis testing is unnecessary because truth is revealed directly rather than discovered through experimentation. Research grants become meaningless when knowledge comes through divine revelation rather than funded investigation. Chapter 8: The Death of Other Faiths. The call to prayer echoes from minarets across Istanbul, but the mosques below stand nearly empty. Imam Abdullah Hassan, who led Friday prayers for 30 years, faces his congregation of 12 remaining worshippers and struggles to explain how Islamic prophecy accounts for Jesus Christ's visible return as divine rather than merely prophetic. The Quran speaks of Isa returning, but not as God incarnate claiming worship, rather than directing it toward Allah. In Mecca, the Kaaba still draws pilgrims, but their numbers dwindle as Muslims worldwide grapple with theological crisis that strikes at Islam's foundation. If Jesus is truly divine, then the Shahada, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger," becomes false testimony. 5 daily prayers toward Mecca lose meaning when the object of worship stands visible above Jerusalem, demanding direct attention. Buddhist temples in Tibet empty as monks confront the reality that enlightenment came not through meditation and reincarnation cycles, but through recognition of the Jewish carpenter they had dismissed as one teacher among many. The Dalai Lama's carefully crafted interfaith diplomacy crumbles when faced with exclusive truth claims that leave no room for religious pluralism. Hindu ashrams across India witness mass conversions as followers of Vishnu, Shiva, and countless other deities acknowledge that the divine manifestation in Jerusalem supersedes their pantheon entirely. Centuries of karma-based theology collapse when confronted with grace-based salvation that renders reincarnation cycles obsolete through immediate divine acceptance. Rabbi David Goldstein of Temple Beth El in New York faces his congregation's crisis of faith as the Messiah they awaited for centuries arrives claiming to be the same Jesus their ancestors rejected. Orthodox Judaism's theological structure fractures as they confront the possibility that their forefathers made the ultimate identification error, missing their Messiah when he first appeared 2,000 years ago. The Vatican's Interfaith Dialogue Office closes permanently as Cardinal Martinez acknowledges that religious diversity was always temporary, pending divine clarification. "We spent decades building bridges between faiths," he explains to reporters. "We never considered that those bridges would become obsolete when absolute truth made relativistic tolerance impossible." Sikh Gurdwaras witness theological upheaval as followers of Guru Nanak question whether their 10 gurus prepared them for submission to the ultimate guru, whose claims supersede all previous religious instruction. The Golden Temple in Amritsar becomes a site of spiritual crisis rather than peaceful worship. Zoroastrian fire temples extinguish their eternal flames as followers of Ahura Mazda acknowledge that light itself has returned in person, making symbolic fire worship obsolete. The ancient Persian religion that influenced Jewish thought about good versus evil faces extinction as cosmic dualism yields to Trinitarian monotheism. New Age spirituality collapses entirely as crystal healers, astrology consultants, and meditation gurus discover that their eclectic approach to divinity was spiritual tourism rather than genuine connection. Oprah's endorsement of many paths to the same destination becomes embarrassingly wrong when only one path proves valid. University comparative religion departments cancel all courses as professors realize they were studying humanity's failed attempts to reach God rather than God's successful attempt to reach humanity. The academic study of world religions transforms from anthropological investigation into historical documentation of spiritual error corrected by divine intervention. The death of other faiths isn't gradual decline, it's immediate obsolescence, as alternative paths to the divine are revealed as dead ends that never reach their intended destination. Chapter 9: Technology in the Kingdom. Mark Zuckerberg stares at Facebook's user engagement metrics and watches them climb to impossible heights, but not for the reasons his algorithms predicted. Status updates flood the platform with testimonies of miraculous healing, family reunions with resurrected relatives, and first-hand accounts of angelic encounters. The content moderation team faces an unprecedented crisis. How do you fact-check miracles? Twitter's trending algorithms break down as #JesusIsHere dominates global conversations in every language simultaneously. Elon Musk's carefully engineered recommendation systems can't process the volume of supernatural content being shared. Blue checkmark verification becomes meaningless when the ultimate authority doesn't need social media validation. Apple's Siri and Amazon's Alexa receive millions of questions about theological doctrine, but their machine learning models weren't trained on data sets that included divine revelation. Hey Siri, how long will Jesus reign on earth? Produces error messages as artificial intelligence confronts intelligence that surpasses artificial limitations entirely. Google's search algorithms attempt to rank websites about Christianity, but how do you optimize search engine results when the subject of the search stands physically present above Jerusalem? The company's "Don't be evil" motto gains new meaning when absolute good makes relative ethics obsolete. Cryptocurrency markets crash to zero as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital currencies become worthless in an economy where divine provision eliminates scarcity. Blockchain technology, designed to create trust without central authority, becomes irrelevant when ultimate authority establishes perfect trust through supernatural means. Netflix cancels all original programming as viewers abandon entertainment for reality that surpasses any fictional narrative. Streaming services can't compete with live coverage of actual miracles broadcast through news networks that struggle to maintain journalistic objectivity while reporting the impossible. Dating apps like Tinder and Bumble experience massive user departure as people discover that eternal relationships make temporary romantic connections seem trivial. Algorithm-based matching becomes unnecessary when divine purpose guides human relationships according to heavenly design rather than swipe-based attraction. Video game developers abandon their virtual worlds as players lose interest in simulated experiences when genuine adventure awaits in the transformed reality outside their screens. PlayStation and Xbox consoles collect dust as gaming communities migrate from digital escapism to supernatural engagement. Tesla's autopilot systems malfunction not due to software bugs, but because transportation infrastructure transforms to accommodate supernatural travel methods. Self-driving cars become obsolete when believers discover they can travel instantly through prayer rather than petroleum-powered vehicles. Amazon's delivery network faces existential crisis as overnight shipping becomes irrelevant when divine provision supplies needs instantaneously. Jeff Bezos's logistics empire crumbles when the ultimate supply chain operates through heavenly warehouses that never run out of inventory. Instagram influencers lose followers en masse as lifestyle envy becomes impossible when everyone gains access to abundant life that makes luxury brands seem like cheap imitations of heavenly provision. The attention economy collapses when all attention turns toward the one who deserves ultimate focus. YouTube's algorithm struggles to recommend content when the most watched videos are simple testimonies of divine encounters rather than polished productions. Content creators abandon their channels as they realize their audiences have found ultimate entertainment in reality that surpasses any content they could produce. Chapter 10. children of two worlds. 7-year-old Emma Martinez has never experienced death, disease, or disappointment because she was born after Christ's return established the kingdom where these things don't exist. She plays with friends who include resurrected children from previous centuries, creating playgroups that span multiple generations of human experience. Her great-grandmother, who died before Emma's birth but returned during the resurrection event, teaches her nursery rhymes from the 1940s while they build sandcastles that never crumble. The kindergarten classroom at Roosevelt Elementary looks different now. Teacher Sarah Johnson doesn't need first aid kits because injuries heal instantly. She doesn't maintain discipline through timeouts because children's hearts have been transformed to desire goodness naturally. Lesson plans about death, divorce, and disappointment are replaced with curricula about eternity, unity, and unlimited possibility. 10-year-old Marcus Chen asks questions that perplex child psychologists studying development in a perfect world. Why did people used to hurt each other, he wonders, unable to comprehend malice because he's never experienced it. His parents, who remember the old world, struggle to explain concepts like war, poverty, and prejudice to a child whose reality includes none of these experiences. Teenage development takes unprecedented paths as adolescents mature without rebellion, addiction, or identity crisis. 16-year-old Jessica Williams doesn't struggle with self-esteem issues because she knows her worth as a beloved child of the King. She doesn't experiment with dangerous behaviors because destructive impulses simply don't exist in her psychological makeup. High schools eliminate guidance counselors because students don't need career advice when their purposes are revealed directly through divine calling rather than aptitude tests and personality assessments. College preparation becomes irrelevant when wisdom comes through relationship with infinite knowledge rather than classroom instruction and standardized testing. Parent-child relationships transform as traditional disciplinary methods become unnecessary. Timeouts are replaced by teaching moments. Punishment yields to instruction. The terrible twos disappear when toddlers' hearts are aligned with heavenly values from birth, rather than requiring years of moral training to overcome selfish impulses. Child development experts study unprecedented phenomena as children born post-return display abilities that previous generations considered impossible. They learn languages instantly through divine gift rather than gradual acquisition. They understand complex theological concepts intuitively rather than through years of religious education. They demonstrate wisdom that surpasses their chronological age because their spirits connect directly to eternal truth. Dr. Amanda Foster, pediatric psychiatrist at Children's Hospital, documents behavioral patterns unknown to previous generations. These children don't experience anxiety because they trust completely in divine provision. They don't develop eating disorders because their bodies function perfectly. They don't struggle with learning disabilities because their minds operate according to divine design rather than natural limitations. The generation gap becomes a chasm as pre-return adults remember scarcity, suffering, and sin, while post-return children know only abundance, joy, and righteousness. Grandparents tell stories about hospitals and police departments that their grandchildren can't comprehend because they've never needed medical treatment or legal protection. Educational systems face complete overhaul as traditional subjects become obsolete or transformed. History class focuses on God's plan unfolding through human events rather than secular political developments. Science class studies how divine power operates through natural laws. rather than how natural laws explain everything without divine involvement. Literature class examines how human creativity reflects the ultimate creator, rather than celebrating human achievement independent of divine inspiration. The children of two worlds represent humanity's future, a generation that will never know the limitations their parents accepted as normal, creating a species gap between those who remember the old world's brokenness and those who only know the new world's perfection. Chapter 11. The Apocrypha Vindicated. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's ancient library in Addis Ababa becomes a pilgrimage destination as scholars worldwide rush to examine texts they had dismissed as non-canonical. The Book of Enoch, rejected by most Christian denominations for centuries, suddenly gains credibility as its detailed descriptions of heavenly hierarchy prove accurate down to the smallest detail. Father Tekle Mariam, keeper of the ancient manuscripts, can barely contain his vindication as researchers discover that Ethiopian Christianity preserved truths that Western churches had discarded. "We never removed these books," he explains to visiting theologians. "While you debated their authenticity, we continued reading them as scripture. Now you see why our ancestors preserved what yours rejected." The Book of Enoch's elaborate descriptions of the Watchers, fallen angels who corrupted humanity, align perfectly with supernatural beings now visible in the transformed world. Its detailed cosmology, dismissed as mythology by Western scholars, proves to be accurate documentation of spiritual realities that modern Christianity had forgotten or ignored. Gnostic Gospels stored in monastery libraries across the Middle East experience renewed scholarly interest as their alternative accounts of Jesus' ministry gain relevance. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on direct spiritual knowledge rather than institutional authority, resonates with believers who now experience unmediated divine communication. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945 and largely dismissed as heretical, becomes required reading as its mystical approach to Christianity proves more accurate than rationalistic Western theology. The Gospel of Philip's teachings about spiritual marriage and divine union describe experiences that believers now encounter directly rather than study academically. Catholic and Protestant scholars face uncomfortable questions about the biblical canon as texts they excluded prove to contain genuine revelations. The Council of Nicaea's decisions in 325 AD, which established Orthodox Christianity's boundaries, are re-examined in light of evidence that some heretical texts contained authentic spiritual insights. The Apocrypha's stories of miraculous healings, angelic interventions, and direct divine communication no longer seem like pious fiction when identical events happen daily in the transformed world. The Book of Tobit's account of the angel Raphael guiding human affairs becomes contemporary documentation rather than ancient legend. Dr. Elaine Pagels, Princeton professor and Gnostic Gospels expert, addresses the Vatican's Theological Commission via video conference. We're discovering that early Christian diversity wasn't deviation from truth. It was exploration of truths that institutional Christianity narrowed for political rather than spiritual reasons. These texts weren't rejected because they were false. They were rejected because they were dangerous to ecclesiastical authority. The Dead Sea Scrolls gain new interpretation as their descriptions of end times events and messianic expectations prove prophetically accurate. The Essene community's separation from mainstream Judaism and emphasis on spiritual purity is vindicated as their understanding of the Messiah's nature proves more accurate than Pharisaic theology. Coptic and Syriac manuscripts, preserved in languages that Western Christianity largely abandoned, reveal theological insights that Greek and Latin translations obscured. Ancient Christian communities in Egypt, Syria, and Ethiopia maintained spiritual traditions that prove more aligned with divine reality than European developments in Christian doctrine. Seminary libraries worldwide undergo complete reorganization as professors realize they must expand their biblical studies programs to include texts they had marginalized or ignored entirely. Systematic theology textbooks become obsolete as the living presence of their subject makes academic speculation unnecessary. Chapter 12: Islam's Greatest Test. The Grand Mosque in Damascus falls silent as Imam Muhammad al-Rashid struggles to lead Friday prayers while grappling with theological crisis that strikes at Islam's core. The figure above Jerusalem claims divinity, not prophetic status, creating an impossible situation for the 1.8 billion Muslims who revere Jesus as Isa but reject his divine nature. In Cairo's Al-Azhar University, Islam's most prestigious center of learning, scholars frantically search Quranic verses and hadith collections for explanations that can reconcile their faith with the visible reality above Jerusalem. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, professor of Islamic theology, addresses emergency faculty meetings where centuries of scholarship crumble under the weight of contradictory evidence. The Quran's clear statements about Jesus, that he was not crucified, not divine, and not the Son of God, clash directly with the returned figure's claims. Surah 4, 157's denial of the crucifixion becomes problematic when the one who was supposedly not crucified displays wounds from crucifixion as proof of his identity and sacrifice. Mecca's pilgrimage numbers drop dramatically as Muslims worldwide question whether their direction of prayer should shift from the Kaaba to Jerusalem, where their acknowledged prophet has returned, claiming ultimate authority. The Hajj, one of Islam's 5 pillars, loses meaning when the object of true worship stands visible rather than requiring symbolic pilgrimage. Convert testimonies flood social media as former Muslims document their theological journey from following the Prophet to worshipping the one the Prophet claimed to follow. Hassan al-Mahmoud, former Imam in London, broadcasts his conversion explanation. "I taught that Jesus was a great prophet, pointing to Allah. I never considered that he might be Allah pointing to himself." The Pakistani government faces riots as the country's Islamic identity conflicts with citizens' growing recognition of Christ's divinity. Prime Minister's attempts to maintain religious unity fail as theological truth transcends political stability. Streets that once echoed with calls to prayer now witness spontaneous Christian worship services. In Iran, the theocratic government struggles to maintain Shia authority when their hidden imam's expected return is overshadowed by the visible presence of Jesus in Jerusalem. Ayatollah's religious pronouncements carry no weight against divine authority that needs no human interpretation or institutional validation. Islamic banking systems collapse not due to economic pressure, but because interest-free finance becomes irrelevant in an economy where divine provision eliminates scarcity and debt. Sharia law loses relevance when perfect divine law supersedes human attempts to codify Allah's will through juridical interpretation. The Dome of the Rock becomes a site of theological crisis rather than Islamic triumph, as Muslims confront the possibility that their beautiful mosque sits on the very spot where their prophet's God claims exclusive worship. Jerusalem's contested status resolves not through political negotiation, but through divine decree that establishes undisputed ownership. Sufi mystical traditions experience vindication as their emphasis on direct divine encounter proves more aligned with spiritual reality than orthodox Islamic theology's focus on legal compliance and doctrinal correctness. Rumi's poetry about divine love gains new meaning when the beloved he described returns in person rather than remaining mystically hidden. Islamic prophecies about Jesus' return prove partially accurate but fundamentally misunderstood. The Mahdi's expected arrival becomes irrelevant when the one greater than any earthly leader establishes direct rule. End-time scenarios described in Islamic eschatology unfold differently than predicted, leaving Muslim scholars to reinterpret prophecies they thought they understood. The crisis splits Islamic communities worldwide as traditional authorities insist on orthodox interpretation, while growing numbers of believers acknowledge that their greatest prophet's testimony about Jesus proves more accurate than their theological systems that limited his role to human messenger rather than divine presence. Chapter 13: The Vatican's Secret Archives. Pope Francis opens the Apostolic Archives' sealed sections for the first time in Vatican history, revealing documents that church hierarchy had hidden for centuries. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, prefect of the archives, leads international scholars through vaults containing papal correspondence that predicted Christ's return with startling accuracy. The third secret of Fatima, partially revealed in 2000 but suspected of containing additional content, proves more apocalyptic than the Vatican admitted. Sister Lucia's complete writings, locked away since her death, describe visions of Christ's return that match current events with precision that proves supernatural rather than human foresight. Medieval manuscripts from Pope Innocent III's private library contain prophecy compilations that accurately predicted the timing and manner of the Second Coming. The Church's suppression of these documents wasn't theological caution. It was fear that premature revelation might trigger mass hysteria or undermine papal authority by suggesting divine revelation came through sources other than official channels. The prophecy of the popes, attributed to Saint Malachy, gains credibility as its prediction that Pope Francis would be the final pontiff proves accurate. The cryptic phrase Petrus Romanus, describing the last pope, takes new meaning as Peter's successor acknowledges that human succession ends when divine authority returns directly. Documents from the infamous Borgia papacy reveal that even corrupt Renaissance popes maintained secret collections of authentic prophecies about Christianity's ultimate vindication. Pope Alexander VI's private papers, hidden for 5 centuries due to their scandalous content, contain accurate predictions about Christ's return that proved his spiritual authenticity despite his moral failures. The Vatican Bank's financial records reveal centuries of funding for archaeological expeditions designed not just to validate biblical history, but to locate artifacts that would herald Christ's return. Secret partnerships with governments and universities funded digs in Israel, searching for prophetic triggers that would signal the end times arrival. Cardinal Ratzinger's pre-papal writings, classified until now, document his theological certainty that the Church's primary purpose was preparing for Christ's return rather than perpetuating institutional survival. His resignation as Pope Benedict XVI, officially attributed to health concerns, was actually motivated by private revelation about the proximity of the Second Coming. The archives reveal correspondence between Vatican astronomers and NASA scientists tracking celestial events with prophetic significance. The Church's investment in space observation wasn't just scientific curiosity. It was systematic monitoring for signs in the heavens that would herald divine intervention. Liberation theology documents, suppressed during the 1980s, prove prophetically accurate in their emphasis on Christ's concern for social justice and economic equality. The Vatican's opposition to liberation theology wasn't doctrinal disagreement. It was fear that premature implementation of kingdom principles might interfere with the timing of divine revelation. Cardinal Sarah Mukamurezi, appointed to oversee the archive's public release, addresses the global controversy. The Church didn't suppress these documents to hide truth from believers. We preserved them until the time when their revelation would confirm rather than confuse faith. That time has arrived. Marian apparition reports from around the world, many never officially approved, prove authentic as their warnings about world events and calls for prayer align perfectly with the preparation necessary for Christ's return. Medjugorje, Garabandal, and dozens of other unofficial apparition sites gain Vatican approval as their messages prove genuinely prophetic. The archive's revelations vindicate Catholic mystical traditions while embarrassing institutional authorities who prioritized organizational stability over spiritual preparation. Saints' visions and mystics' prophecies, marginalized by rational theology, prove more accurate than academic biblical scholarship that dismissed supernatural revelation as pre-modern superstition. Chapter 14: Eastern Orthodox Mysteries. Mount Athos becomes a pilgrimage destination as the ancient monastic community's mystical traditions prove more aligned with spiritual reality than Western Christianity's rational theology. Father Paisios, elder monk of Vatopedi Monastery, had prophesied Christ's return timing with accuracy that secular observers can no longer dismiss as religious delusion. The Orthodox doctrine of theosis, humans becoming God by grace, takes on immediate relevance as believers experience divine transformation that Protestant theology deemed impossible and Catholic doctrine approached with caution. What Eastern mystics described through centuries of contemplative practice becomes accessible experience rather than theoretical possibility. Russian Orthodox prophecies about Moscow as the Third Rome gain political significance as Russia's role in end times events proves more important than Western powers expected. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 and Rome's spiritual decline positioned Moscow as Christianity's final earthly center before Christ's direct rule eliminates the need for any earthly religious capital. The Jesus Prayer, repeated millions of times by Orthodox monks throughout history, proves more than meditative practice when the name it invokes manifests in visible presence. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, transforms from petition to conversation as the one addressed responds directly to those who call upon his name. Icons, dismissed by Protestant iconoclasm as idolatrous, vindicate Orthodox theology as the painted images become windows into spiritual reality rather than mere artistic representation. The Pantocrator images in Byzantine churches prove accurate portraits as believers recognize the returned Christ's features in artwork created centuries before photography existed. Patriarch Kirill of Moscow addresses the Orthodox world from the Kremlin's Cathedral of the Dormition, acknowledging that Eastern Christianity's preservation of ancient traditions prepared believers for realities that Western Christianity had rationalized away. We maintained the mysteries while the West explained them. Now you see which approach preserved truth. The Great Schism of 1054, which separated Eastern and Western Christianity, resolves as Christ's return validates orthodox positions on papal authority, clerical celibacy, and the Filioque controversy. The Bishop of Rome's claims to universal jurisdiction become irrelevant when the universal king establishes direct rule that needs no human representative. Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, converted from Christian cathedral to mosque, reverts to its original purpose as Christ's presence sanctifies the space that emperors dedicated to his worship 15 centuries ago. The building's Christian mosaics, plastered over during Islamic rule, miraculously reappear as divine restoration supersedes human renovation efforts. Orthodox emphasis on apophatic theology, knowing God through what he is not rather than what he is, proves superior to Western cataphatic approaches that attempted to define divine nature through positive statements. The mystery that Eastern fathers preserved through negative theology reveals itself when systematic theology's positive assertions prove inadequate to describe infinite reality. The Divine Liturgy's ancient structure, unchanged for over a millennium, provides worship framework that accommodates divine presence more naturally than Protestant services designed for human congregation or Catholic masses focused on institutional hierarchy. Orthodox liturgical theology proves prophetically accurate in its assumption that earthly worship participates in heavenly reality. Mount Tabor's significance as the Transfiguration site gains new meaning as the location where Christ first revealed his divine glory becomes a center for understanding his permanent revelation of that same glory to the entire world. The Taboric light that medieval hesychasts claim to see through prayer becomes visible reality that validates their mystical experiences. The Eastern Orthodox calendar's different dating system proves providential as their calculation of feast days aligns more accurately with the prophetic timing of Christ's return. What seemed like stubborn traditionalism in maintaining the Julian calendar proves to be preservation of chronological framework that better reflects divine rather than papal authority. Chapter 15, the Protestant Reformation's final chapter. Wittenberg's Castle Church, where Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, becomes a pilgrimage site as Protestant reformers' theological insights prove prophetically accurate. Luther's emphasis on salvation by faith alone vindicates as the returned Christ, confirms that institutional works cannot earn divine acceptance. Only divine grace can transform human hearts. John Calvin's doctrine of predestination creates theological crisis as the actual process of divine selection operates differently than Geneva's reformer predicted. The elect prove to be chosen not through divine decree that bypasses human response, but through divine foreknowledge that honors authentic faith while rejecting mere intellectual assent to doctrine. Baptist churches worldwide celebrate vindication of their believer baptism position as infant baptism proves insufficient for genuine conversion that requires personal decision rather than parental choice. Immersion baptism's symbolism of death and resurrection gains literal meaning as believers experience spiritual transformation that makes symbolic action prophetically accurate. Methodist emphasis on social holiness proves more aligned with kingdom values than Reformed theology's focus on individual salvation. John Wesley's connection between personal piety and social justice reflects Christ's priorities more accurately than Lutheran separation of gospel and law or Calvinist emphasis on divine sovereignty that minimizes human responsibility. Pentecostal gifts of the Spirit become universal experiences rather than denominational distinctives, as every believer receives supernatural abilities that cessationist theology claimed ended with the apostolic age. Speaking in tongues, divine healing, and prophetic revelation prove normal rather than exceptional aspects of Christian experience. The Adventist movement's emphasis on Christ's return, mocked for centuries after failed predictions, gains respect as their focus on the second coming proves more accurate than mainline denominations' concentration on present religious experience rather than future divine intervention. Presbyterian polity's representative government becomes obsolete when divine theocracy eliminates the need for human ecclesiastical structures. Church governance through elected sessions and synods proves unnecessary when the head of the church rules directly rather than through denominational hierarchy. Quaker emphasis on inner light and direct divine revelation vindicates as believers experience unmediated spiritual communication that makes formal worship services and professional clergy optional rather than essential. The Friends' simple worship style proves more adaptable to divine presence than elaborate liturgical traditions. Anglican via media, the middle way between Catholic and Protestant extremes, proves unnecessary when Christ's return eliminates the need for compromise between theological positions. The Church of England's attempted balance between episcopal authority and Reformed doctrine becomes irrelevant when divine authority supersedes both Catholic tradition and Protestant innovation. Lutheran confessions prove partially accurate in their emphasis on justification by faith, but incomplete in their understanding of sanctification's supernatural dimensions. The Augsburg Confession's theological formulations require revision when lived experience of divine transformation exceeds doctrinal descriptions of spiritual change. Evangelical missions become obsolete as global evangelization accomplishes itself through Christ's visible presence rather than human missionary efforts. The Great Commission's command to make disciples of all nations fulfills instantly when every nation witnesses divine revelation that requires no human translation or cultural adaptation. Reformed theology's emphasis on divine sovereignty proves accurate, while its limitation of human responsibility requires adjustment. God's absolute rule manifests perfectly, while human response remains genuinely significant, rather than mechanistically predetermined through divine decree that eliminates meaningful choice. The Protestant principle of Scripture alone proves inadequate when the subject of Scripture returns to provide authoritative interpretation that supersedes human hermeneutics. Biblical authority remains supreme, while human interpretation of biblical authority becomes unnecessary when the divine author provides direct explanation of his written revelation. Chapter 16. Democracy dies in divine light. The United States Capitol building stands empty as Congress cancels its final session, unable to legislate in a realm where divine decree supersedes human law. Speaker of the House. Nancy Pelosi's gavel falls silent as representative democracy proves obsolete when the ultimate representative establishes direct rule without need for elected intermediaries. The Supreme Court issues its final ruling, a unanimous decision acknowledging that constitutional interpretation becomes meaningless when the Constitution's creator establishes authority that transcends written documents. Chief Justice John Roberts writes the court's last opinion: "We hereby dissolve this institution, recognizing that human justice cannot improve upon divine justice, and constitutional law cannot supersede eternal law." Presidential campaigns end mid-stride as candidates withdraw from races that have lost all meaning. Television networks cancel election coverage as voters realize their ballots carry no weight against divine appointment. Democracy's fundamental premise, that government derives authority from popular consent, crumbles when authority derives from supernatural source that requires no human validation. The Pentagon closes its war rooms as military strategy becomes irrelevant under a ruler who needs no defense contractors, intelligence agencies, or strategic planning committees. Five-star generals who commanded global operations surrender their authority to the Prince of Peace, whose army consists of heavenly beings rather than human soldiers equipped with earthly weapons. Capitol Hill lobbyists abandon their offices as influence peddling becomes impossible when the ultimate authority cannot be corrupted, convinced, or compromised through political pressure. K Street empties as special interests discover that divine interests cannot be modified through campaign contributions or professional persuasion. The Federal Reserve closes permanently as monetary policy becomes obsolete in an economy where divine provision eliminates scarcity, inflation, and the need for interest rate manipulation. Jerome Powell's final press conference acknowledges that central banking cannot manage supernatural abundance through natural economic mechanisms. Political parties dissolve as their platforms become irrelevant under divine rule that transcends human ideological divisions. Republican emphasis on individual responsibility and Democratic focus on collective welfare both prove incomplete approaches to governance that achieves perfect balance between personal accountability and social justice through supernatural administration. The Department of Justice shuts down as law enforcement becomes unnecessary when lawlessness becomes impossible. FBI headquarters empties as federal investigation proves pointless when omniscient authority knows all truth without need for human detective work or legal procedures to establish guilt or innocence. Campaign finance reform becomes historically curious as unlimited political spending proves meaningless when ultimate political power cannot be purchased through any amount of earthly currency. Citizens United and other landmark cases about money and politics become academic footnotes in democracy's obituary. Voting machines sit unused in warehouses as election infrastructure becomes unnecessary when divine appointment eliminates competitive campaigns for positions that no longer exist. Ballot counting and recount procedures prove historically interesting, but practically obsolete when authority transfers through supernatural rather than electoral processes. The Constitution's separation of powers, executive, legislative, judicial, becomes quaint historical curiosity when all power rests in single divine person who cannot abuse authority because his nature prevents corruption, tyranny, or injustice that human systems were designed to prevent through structural limitations. Democratic institutions worldwide follow America's example as parliamentary systems, constitutional monarchies, and republican governments acknowledge their obsolescence. The United Nations General Assembly holds its final session, dissolving the organization that attempted to unite nations under human leadership, when divine leadership makes international cooperation automatic rather than negotiated. Political science departments in universities close as their subject matter becomes historical rather than contemporary. Professors who spent careers studying power, authority, and governance find their expertise relegated to museum displays about humanity's failed attempts at self-government before divine government made human alternatives unnecessary. Chapter 17: Wall Street's Last Day. The New York Stock Exchange trading floor falls silent at 9:30 a.m. as the opening bell rings for the final time in financial history. Traders stare at screens displaying impossible data, every stock price simultaneously approaching zero, not due to market crash, but due to irrelevance of ownership in an economy where divine provision eliminates scarcity and competition. Warren Buffett addresses Berkshire Hathaway shareholders for his final annual meeting, acknowledging that value investing becomes meaningless when infinite value makes comparative analysis obsolete. "I spent my career finding undervalued companies," he explains to empty chairs. "I never considered that all earthly companies would become overvalued compared to kingdom economics." The Federal Reserve Bank of New York empties its gold vaults, not through theft or transfer, but through recognition that precious metals lose preciousness when the ultimate treasure reveals himself in person. Centuries of accumulated wealth prove worthless when wealth itself is redefined from material possession to spiritual relationship. Credit card companies declare bankruptcy not from defaulted payments, but from obsolete business models, as debt becomes impossible in an economy where divine provision meets all needs instantly. Visa and MasterCard's global payment networks shut down when payment itself becomes unnecessary between beings who share unlimited resources through supernatural abundance. Goldman Sachs closes its investment banking operations as mergers and acquisitions prove pointless when all ownership transfers to divine authority that cannot be bought, sold, or leveraged through financial instruments. IPOs become historically curious as initial public offerings cannot compete with ultimate private ownership that includes everything. Cryptocurrency exchanges crash permanently as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital currencies prove powerless against currency that exists outside any blockchain or distributed ledger technology. Satoshi Nakamoto's revolutionary creation becomes historical footnote when the creator of everything establishes economic system that needs no technological innovation to ensure trust or prevent fraud. Insurance companies liquidate as risk assessment becomes impossible when supernatural protection eliminates all insurable risks. Lloyd's of London, which underwrote maritime risks for centuries, cancels all policies as divine oversight makes human risk management obsolete and presumptuous. Mortgage lenders close their offices as property ownership transfers from private or corporate control to divine stewardship that provides housing without need for loan applications, credit checks, or monthly payments. Foreclosure becomes impossible when the ultimate property owner ensures that everyone has appropriate shelter according to divine rather than economic criteria. The Dow Jones Industrial Average publishes its final numbers, not because markets close, but because measurement becomes meaningless when value transcends quantification. 30 companies that represented American industrial strength prove insignificant compared to power that created industry itself and can replace it instantly with superior alternatives. Pension funds and retirement accounts become obsolete as eternal life eliminates the need to save for old age that no longer comes, and death benefits prove unnecessary when death itself is conquered. Social Security Administration closes as the ultimate security provider ensures care that government programs could never deliver through taxation and bureaucracy. Day trading algorithms crash as artificial intelligence designed to capitalize on market fluctuations cannot process markets that operate according to divine rather than mathematical principles. High-frequency trading proves useless when ultimate frequency operates outside time constraints that limit human and computer decision-making. Economic indicators, GDP, unemployment rates, inflation indexes, become historically interesting but practically meaningless as prosperity measures prove inadequate to assess abundance that exceeds measurement capabilities. The Bureau of Labor Statistics issues final reports acknowledging that labor itself is transformed when work becomes voluntary expression of creativity rather than necessary survival activity. Payday loan operations close permanently as emergency lending becomes unnecessary when emergencies themselves cannot exist under divine protection that prevents crisis and provides immediate resources for any legitimate need. Check cashing stores empty as currency exchange proves pointless when currency itself becomes obsolete under economic system that operates through divine distribution rather than human transaction. Chapter 18: The Social Media Apocalypse. Instagram's headquarters in Menlo Park empties as influencers worldwide log off permanently, unable to compete with content created by actual divine presence. Kylie Jenner's final post receives 0 engagement as her 300 million followers abandon lifestyle envy for lifestyle transformation that makes luxury brands seem like cheap imitations of supernatural provision. TikTok's algorithm breaks down completely as viral videos about miraculous healing and angelic encounters flood the platform beyond machine learning capabilities. The app's Chinese ownership becomes irrelevant when content moderation faces phenomena that transcend cultural boundaries and governmental control through supernatural rather than technological means. YouTube's recommendation engine crashes as the platform's most watched content shifts from entertainment to testimony, with simple smartphone videos of divine encounters receiving billions of views while polished productions from major studios sit unwatched. PewDiePie's subscriber count becomes historically curious as attention spans abandon artificial stimulation for authentic spiritual experience. Facebook's data centers struggle to process the volume of miracle testimonies, family reunion photos with resurrected relatives, and first-hand accounts of angelic visitations. Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse vision proves obsolete as virtual reality cannot compete with supernatural reality that provides experiences no technology could simulate or improve. Twitter's trending algorithms surrender to content that breaks every previous engagement metric as #JesusIsHere dominates global conversations in every language simultaneously. Elon Musk's blue checkmark verification system becomes meaningless when ultimate authority needs no social media validation or subscriber confirmation. LinkedIn closes its professional networking features as career advancement becomes irrelevant when vocations are assigned through divine calling rather than networking, resume building, or professional development courses. Job searching proves unnecessary when purpose comes through supernatural revelation rather than employment applications or headhunter recruitment. Snapchat's disappearing message feature proves ironically permanent as users screenshot every miraculous moment, unable to let supernatural content vanish after 24 hours. Stories about divine encounters demand preservation rather than temporary sharing, as historical documentation takes precedence over casual communication. OnlyFans shuts down permanently as subscribers abandon paid content for relationships with eternal rather than temporal value. The platform's business model collapses when authentic intimacy becomes available through spiritual connection that makes artificial stimulation seem hollow and unfulfilling by comparison. Reddit's discussion forums transform from debate platforms to testimony, sharing communities as argumentative discourse yields to collaborative worship and mutual encouragement. Upvote and downvote mechanisms become unnecessary when truth is self-evident rather than determined through crowdsourced opinion validation. Dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, and Match.com experience mass user exodus as algorithm-based romantic matching proves inferior to divine matchmaking that connects souls according to eternal compatibility rather than superficial attraction metrics or shared interests that may not survive spiritual transformation. WhatsApp messaging decreases dramatically as direct spiritual communication makes technological intermediaries feel clunky and inefficient. Prayer becomes more reliable than cellular networks for connecting with both divine and human relationships across any distance without concern for data plans or network coverage. Twitch streaming loses viewers as gamers abandon virtual adventures for participation in actual supernatural events that provide excitement, challenge, and accomplishment that video games attempted to simulate but could never genuinely deliver through digital rather than spiritual engagement. The attention economy collapses entirely as human focus shifts from manufactured content designed to capture and monetize attention toward the source of all attention, who deserves unlimited focus without need for advertising revenue, subscriber growth metrics, or engagement optimization strategies. Chapter 19: The Last Atheist's Confession. Dr. Richard Dawkins sits in his Oxford study surrounded by decades of written work. The God Delusion, The Blind Watchmaker, Climbing Mount, Improbable, all now testimonies to intellectual pride that collapsed under the weight of empirical evidence. His hands shake as he begins what he knows will be his final interview, broadcast globally to audiences who followed his atheistic crusade for generations. I built my entire career on the premise that belief in God was a virus of the mind, a delusion that intelligent people should overcome through rational thinking, he admits to the camera. I was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong about details. Fundamentally, embarrassingly, catastrophically wrong about the most important question in existence. The evolutionary biologist who spent decades explaining life's complexity through natural selection now faces life itself standing before him, claiming to be the designer he insisted never existed. I argued that complexity required no designer because natural processes could account for appearance of design. I never considered that appearance of design might actually be evidence of an actual designer. Christopher Hitchens, resurrected along with all the dead, appears at Dawkins' door to discuss their shared atheistic assumptions with the perspective of someone who discovered the afterlife they both denied. "My friend," Hitchens says with characteristic wit, "it seems our razor-sharp intellects were dulled by our own pride. We cut away God so cleanly that we severed ourselves from reality itself." Dr. Lawrence Krauss joins the conversation via video link from Arizona State University, where he's dismantling his physics department's materialistic assumptions. "We taught students that something could come from nothing through quantum mechanics. We never imagined that everything came from someone who transcends our understanding of causation entirely. The new atheism movement's leading voices, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Jerry Coyne, issue public apologies for leading millions away from truth through sophisticated arguments that proved sophisticated delusions. Their books, which sold millions of copies and influenced countless minds, become historical cautionary tales about intellectual arrogance masquerading as scientific objectivity. Professor Steven Pinker addresses Harvard students for his final lecture on evolutionary psychology, acknowledging that human behavior cannot be fully explained through natural selection when supernatural transformation reveals capabilities that evolution never predicted or produced. We reduced human nature to genetic programming and environmental conditioning. We missed the spiritual dimension entirely. The American Atheists Organization dissolves as its president, David Silverman, converts publicly and urges members to abandon their legal battles against religious expression. We fought for separation of church and state, while the state itself was about to become obsolete under divine rule. Our constitutional arguments prove meaningless when the Constitution's author returns to establish perfect government. Atheist philosophers who spent careers arguing against God's existence face existential crisis as their life's work proves not just wrong, but harmfully wrong. They led others away from truth through intellectual arguments that seemed compelling, but were ultimately founded on assumptions about reality that proved completely false. The Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science closes permanently as its founder acknowledges that reason properly applied should have led to God rather than away from him, and science properly understood should have revealed divine design rather than concealing it through materialistic interpretations of evidence. Former atheists worldwide document their conversion experiences as the most dramatic intellectual reversals in human history. University philosophy departments eliminate courses on atheistic arguments as their professors acknowledge that skepticism about God's existence was skepticism about existence itself. The Last Atheist's Confession becomes humanity's most watched testimony as someone who spent decades fighting against God publicly surrenders to the reality he can no longer deny. I wanted to be intellectually fulfilled by a universe without God, Dawkins concludes. I discovered that intellectual fulfillment requires acknowledgement of the intelligence behind intelligence itself. The irony strikes observers worldwide. The man who claimed that belief in God was delusion discovers that disbelief in God was the actual delusion, and the evidence he demanded for God's existence was provided in the most undeniable way possible, through personal, visible, global manifestation that no rational person could reject. Chapter 20. The Question That Haunts Tomorrow. As testimonies flood the airwaves and millions bow before the figure hovering above Jerusalem, a disturbing whisper begins to circulate through the remaining skeptics and even some believers. Ancient warnings echo from forgotten scriptures about signs and lying wonders, so convincing that even the elect might be deceived. The returned figure performs undeniable miracles, speaks with divine authority, and demonstrates supernatural power that transforms the world. But buried in the dusty margins of biblical prophecy lies a terrifying possibility that few dare voice. What if the greatest deception isn't the denial of Christ's return, but the acceptance of the wrong Christ? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 warns of a powerful delusion that will fool the masses, a false Christ so convincing that he will sit in God's temple claiming to be God himself. Matthew 24 speaks of false Christs who will perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the very elect. Revelation 13 describes a beast that performs miraculous signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in full view of the people. Dr. Michael Heiser, biblical scholar and expert on supernatural warfare, broadcasts from an undisclosed location with a warning that chills viewers worldwide. We assumed the Antichrist would be obviously evil, a political dictator who would force worship through persecution. We never considered that he might be supernaturally convincing, performing genuine miracles that make resistance seem foolish rather than faithful. The figure above Jerusalem fulfills prophecies, but scholars notice subtle discrepancies in his message. He speaks of love, but seems to bypass the need for repentance. He demonstrates power, but avoids specific references to his sacrificial death. He calls for worship, but doesn't emphasize the narrow path that leads to life through suffering and self-denial. A small group of believers, led by Pastor David Wilkerson Jr., retreats to prayer and fasting, questioning whether the worldwide celebration might be premature. The real Jesus said many would come in his name and deceive many. What if the deception isn't political or obviously false? What if it's supernatural and seemingly true? The most disturbing evidence emerges from careful examination of biblical chronology. According to Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy and Revelation's timeline, certain events must precede Christ's return, events that haven't occurred. The temple hasn't been rebuilt. The tribulation period hasn't been completed. The Antichrist hasn't been revealed and defeated. Technology amplifies the deception as artificial intelligence and deep learning algorithms confirm the figure's authenticity through analysis that seems objective, but may be programmed by the very forces of deception the Bible warns against. Social media platforms suppress dissenting voices as misinformation, making it nearly impossible to question the narrative without being silenced. Children born after the appearance seem different, more compliant, less questioning, spiritually marked in ways that concern the few remaining watchmen who remember biblical warnings about the mark of the beast and generational consequences of spiritual deception that affects not just individuals, but entire populations. The final question emerges like a nightmare from the deepest fears of prophetic students. What if humanity just celebrated the arrival of the Antichrist rather than the return of Christ? What if the great falling away Paul prophesied wasn't people leaving Christianity, but Christians accepting a false Christ, so convincing that rejection requires supernatural discernment?